What's the creepiest true story that happened to you or someone you know? This happened to my father. I will tell the story the way that he told it to me to make the story better. I was 22 years old. I had just gotten a place closer to my new job, but the neighborhood I lived in was a little secluded. Maybe 4 houses within a mile, and then nothing for miles after that. I was having a normal night, on maybe my first week there. I watched some TV and then fell asleep. When I woke up around 1 a.m., I was about to go to my bedroom when I remembered to turn off the bathroom light at the opposite end of the house. As I was walking through the living room, I could barely see through to the kitchen and even further to the dining room. It was pitch black because the bathroom door was closed. In the dining room, however, I saw something tall standing in the corner. I froze, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it was an old man or woman in a white gown with white hair. "Hey!" I yelled. The old person sprinted towards me like a jet. I sprinted back to my room where the light was still on. I put my hands up, ready to fight, and the old person came lunging in, and then when they saw me, they stopped and said, "Why are you in my house?" I pretended I was leaving and apologized while I eased into the closed bathroom, locked the door, and called 911 with the house phone. It turns out a woman about a half a mile away in the neighborhood had a form of dementia and wandered into my house while I was sleeping. When I was in college, I lived in a big house with 9 other students. I went to college in Ireland, and our house was over 100 years old. It was 3 stories tall, and my bedroom was in the extension on the ground floor. We all loved the house, but it was very creepy if there was only a few of us there. Being an old house, you'd expect old house noises, and there was always creaking and stuff. One weekend in October, I was the only housemate staying the night, as everyone else went home to visit their families. I asked my boyfriend to stay with me, because I was a bit scared to be alone. At about 4 a.m., I suddenly woke up with a sense of dread, and it felt like something was in the bedroom. It was pitch black and I couldn't see, but I could feel that something was off. I started panicking and shouting at my boyfriend that someone was there. He assured me there wasn't, as our eyes adjusted to the darkness. As I was panicking, there was a loud smash of glass out in the hallway. My boyfriend jumped out of bed and locked my bedroom as fast as possible. We thought there was someone trying to break into the house, but we heard no other noises. We stayed in the bedroom listening for a while, too scared to face an intruder, and too weary to go back to sleep. It took us about an hour of panicking before we left the bedroom to see what had smashed. As we left the bedroom, I stepped on glass and cut my foot. Turns out the Velux skylight in the hallway outside my bedroom had been smashed, but only the inside panel of glass, not the outside. It had a proper impact in the middle of the skylight, like it was punched or hit directly with an object, with a significant amount of force, but the other pane was fine. There was no one else in the house, and no other noise, so we have no idea how this happened. The landlord was surprisingly very understanding, and believed me when I told him what happened. There were a few other creepy things in that house, but this was the one that none of us could explain. Now, I unfortunately do not have a very interesting life, so I have no stories of my own. However, I do have a very interesting story from my uncle. My uncle lives in West Virginia, one of the more remote states in the eastern US. While his main house is in town, he also has a small cabin up on Spruce Mountain, where he and my aunt would go during the summers. This cabin is very remote, and accessed only by jeep trails, and it isn't connected to the electrical grid. So my aunt and uncle decided to take advantage of a 3-day weekend sometime in the late 80s, and they headed out to the cabin for some fly fishing and relaxation in the woods. They took my uncle's '74 Bronco, as that was the only vehicle able to get up the mountainside. When they arrived, my aunt went out to sketch some, while my uncle unpacked and built a fire in the cabin, as it was already getting dark. As night began to fall, my uncle noted how unusually quiet the woods were. He's been camping, canoeing, and backpacking all over the world, and he still says that this is the quietest he has ever heard them. What happened next is the part I still don't quite believe, but I have it here exactly as my uncle told it to me. He and my aunt go to bed, and the fire dies. My uncle awoke to a strange thumping coming from outside. This quickly woke the dog, which ran under the bed. He thought it was probably a bear and grabbed his 444 Marlin to go deal with it. As he pulled the gun out from its case, the door to the outside swung open, and a large hairy shape appeared silhouetted in the moonlight. He said he never quite got a good look at it, but the one thing he really remembers is the overpowering smell. It was a stench of decay. He quickly emptied the 444, and while he didn't get a kill shot, he did scratch the beast's arm, which caused it to run squealing into the woods. He and my aunt immediately grabbed their things, got in the Bronco, and hightailed it out of there. Whatever my uncle saw, he claims it was the Sasquatch, never really bothered them again, and when he returned in the morning with more people and more firepower to retrieve his remaining gear, he found little evidence of any intrusion, except for a single strange footprint. I really don't know whether to believe my uncle or not, as he has several other strange beliefs, most recently that the Earth is expanding slowly over time. However, I will be heading up to their cabin for the first time this year, so I guess I'll have to find out for myself. Context: my mom's college boyfriend became her stalker after she left his awful, abusive ass back in the 80s. Several years ago, though, just before the last Harry Potter movie came out, my mom and I were marathoning the other 7 movies, and at about 1 a.m. the phone rang. Normally, we don't answer. We figure if it's important, they'll leave a message, but a call that late at night is usually urgent. Mom answers, and almost immediately her face changes, and she tells me, "Go wake up your father." Shit, I've never seen my mom this scared, so I run upstairs and get him. Back downstairs, she's still on the phone, and I have no idea what's going on. Dad has some words with the caller, and we hug it out in the kitchen. This is when I found out my mom had a stalker. Despite him being silent for years, and their whole breakup happening halfway across the country, he had somehow found us. Said he'd driven by our house. Complimented the neighborhood. Freaks me out to this day, wondering how much he knows about us, and if I've ever talked to him unwittingly. This happened to a friend of mine, and was verified by her sister and girlfriend. The 3 of them were camping in an area in southern Utah, and it was during the fall/early winter, so it got dark early, around 5 o'clock. When it started getting dark there, the 3 of them built a fire and sat around it, just talking and eating, normal stuff. Everything was fine for a while, but they started to hear this weird chirping noise. She described it to me as a kookaburra call slowed down. They got kind of freaked out at this point because it didn't sound like any regular animal. They also kept noticing rustling and movement out of the corners of their eyes, but could never see what was making it. After a while, they went to bed, and everything was fine until my friend was woken up in the middle of the night to see what looked like hands pressed up against the outside of her tent. She then heard a wet breathing sound, like when someone has a stuffy throat and kind of wheezes while breathing. She said she was so scared she couldn't talk, but was able to wake up her sister. They stayed quiet, and eventually the handprints kind of just faded away. In the morning, they wanted to get the hell out of there, so they started packing up their stuff at sunrise. My friend looked around where the handprints had been, and saw a trail of long, skinny footprints leading up to their campsite, but not away from it. Her and her sister aren't the kind to bullshit around, so I do believe that this really happened. To this day, she's convinced it was a skinwalker. When I was in my very early 20s, my mom and I shared a house, and we had a stalker. The first night we stayed in the house, someone got into our car. My mom happened to come outside, saw him, set off the panic alarm on the car, and scared him away. My backpack had been in the car, and he'd dumped the contents into the floorboard, but left the paycheck that I had just cashed, and all the cash was still in a bank envelope. The police said it seemed that they were searching for something specific, and really questioned me about what that might be, but I have no idea. Police were able to get a partial palm print off the car, but had no matches in their system. My mom and I were doing yard work and found a phone cord under our deck. It connected into the phone box on the outside of the house. We called the phone company out, and they said that they figured somebody had been using the cord to hook up a phone and lay under our deck to listen in on our phone calls. They removed the cord and put a lock on the phone box. We also frequently heard someone walking outside our windows at night. We would call the police, and they would drive by but never see anyone. Another time, all of the light bulbs from our exterior lights were removed. Once, we even came home and my mom realized that a pair of earrings and a stuffed animal that had been sitting on her dresser were missing. There was no sign of anyone having broken in, but those items never turned up, and we were sure someone had been in the house. We frequently heard this weird thump and squeak noise that we could never figure out what caused it. Another time, my mom was raking leaves at the front of the house and saw something in one of our bushes. It was a voice-activated recorder, wrapped in black plastic and tied to the trunk of one of our bushes. The recorder was tapped into our phone line. Someone had gotten under our house, drilled a hole through our foundation, and run a phone cord through the hole into the recorder in the bush. We have no idea how a neighbor didn't see or hear this happening. The police, who were well aware of the issues by this point, now seemed to realize that this was a serious and scary problem. They sent several officers out to investigate the recorder. We were in the house talking to an officer, and we heard the thump/squeak noise that we had always heard. We told the officer, "That's it, that's the noise we can't identify." As it turns out, at that moment, an officer had been crawling under the house and bumped the pipe. He was able to repeat the noise. The police figured that it was almost impossible to get into or out of the crawl space under our house without bumping that pipe. And we heard that noise often. The police think that whoever it was getting into the crawl space and lying under the house listening to us. We put a cover over the entrance and glued it down. We put sequins in a certain order in the glue so we could tell if it had been removed and re-glued. It was all insanely creepy. We eventually moved. I moved in with my boyfriend, now husband, on a second-floor apartment. I felt so much safer with people all around, and figured that the stalking issue was behind me. Not long after we moved in, though, I noticed that our caller ID wasn't working. I called the phone company, and they informed me that a Mr. Kramer had called and requested that the caller ID service be turned off on our phone. I had a meltdown. I was so upset. First off, because the phone company let some random person make changes on our phone line, and secondly, because apparently the issues were not behind me, and they were planning something and didn't want the caller ID to show up. I put a password on our account so no changes could be made without it, and that was the last issue we ever had. I really think the caller ID issue might have been unrelated. Maybe someone was accidentally making changes to the wrong account or something. Either way, it was very creepy, though I have to admit, if the person had wanted to do something bad to either one of us, there were surely plenty of times that could have been done. It really seems they just wanted to observe us and scare us. I was camping with my dog and my cousin at our spot way out in the backwoods. We attempted to fish at a lake nearby, set up camp in a dry riverbed, collected some firewood, cooked some smokies and bannock over the fire, and darkness began to fall. As darkness fell, we heard a wolf howl in the distance. We brushed it off since it was pretty far away. Soon enough, though, we heard another howl, much closer. Now, if you've done your research, you'll know that you usually don't have to worry about wolves, unless you have a dog with you. We built the fire up and decided if we hear another howl, we're making a run for his truck and putting my dog in. Sure enough, we heard another, so we decide, let's go. He grabbed his machete, I grabbed my tomahawk and shambuk. If you don't know, it's a type of African whip, called my dog, and we bolted up the riverbed. As we reached the head of the trail to where we had parked his truck, my dog stopped to pick up a stick. I turned around and called him again, and as I did, we heard another howl about 20 feet away. He heard it too, and we ran to the truck like a bat out of hell. My knuckles were white around my tomahawk. As soon as I got my dog into the truck, the tension subsided. We headed back to the campsite, hoping to see some wolves, but they had moved on. There were, however, some tracks in the riverbed, big enough for my hands to fit inside, and I have pretty large hands. I ended up letting my dog sleep with me, but I kept my weapons close. I was really glad that trip didn't end with me having to axe a wolf. When I was in middle school, my younger brother and I were left at home alone for several hours in the evening. I believe my mom brought my dad to the emergency room before we got home from school. He had numerous health problems. Anyway, my brother and I are on the living room couch watching TV, and at this point, it's dark outside. To our right is the kitchen and a sliding glass door with the curtains open. I lived in a small neighborhood, so neighbors were close, but we had a lot of trees and shrubs in the back, to the point you couldn't actually see any light when looking out the glass door from the couch. It was pitch black. and eventually my younger brother started saying he wanted me to close the curtain on the sliding glass door because he was scared. But I was also too afraid to go do it, so I let it be and just focused on the TV. He got so scared he ran down the hallway, which is in between the living room and kitchen, to his room, and I'm left there alone, with the pitch black window lurking in my peripheral. A few minutes go by, and I decide to go to his room and tell him we can both go close the curtain together. Perfect solution, I thought. He agrees, and we walk down the hall. In what couldn't have been more than a few minutes from when I first went to his room, we get to the end of the hallway and turn right into the kitchen, and see, the curtain has gone from completely opened to completely closed. We shit bricks, or whatever middle school aged kids would have done in the late 90s. We run to my room in the back of the house and wait for however long it took for my parents to get back. I'm an open-minded but skeptical person. To this day, I don't believe in ghosts, nor do I think aliens visit our planet or anything like that. This was probably the weirdest experience I've ever had. My brother and I still have no explanation for what happened that night. There's always been rumors that if you travel far enough back into a certain part of my town, you'll reach a hidden community filled with crazy people who hate outsiders. The road back there is very easy to find and travel on, which made me pretty skeptical right away. So one day, a friend and I drove back there in my truck. I had looked at the place on Google Earth, and it didn't seem to be more than a small group of ranch-style homes. Well, shit went south pretty quick. The first house we passed had this weird army of dogs running around. They all started going batshit crazy, so we sped up. But that was like the warning bell, because people started coming out of every fucking house, and they were all yelling at us. My friend and I both started freaking out. We speed past and try to find the first place to turn around and get out. As I'm making my U-turn, rocks are starting to hit my truck, and one guy was walking straight from his garage with what looked like a shotgun. He didn't shoot, but I do have some big dents on my truck from the rocks. We hauled ass out of there, and I had to lie to my dad and tell him that shit flew out of a car in front of me on the freeway and hit me to cause the dents. This happened around 3 years ago. I was sitting in the kitchen, and it was around 10 p.m. I heard a really loud thump in the basement. I live alone with 2 dogs, so any sound is somewhat frightening to me. So as I'm walking down the stairs to the basement, I heard the thumping again, in an oddly rhythmic pattern. I creak open the door into the basement bedroom, and I see my dog is just ramming his head and body into the wall, over and over. I can't explain to you how shockingly unnatural looking it was. It looked like he was controlled or something. I called him over, and he stopped and came upstairs with me. 3 hours later, I hear the thumping again. I get out of bed. However, when I went down to check, it was my other dog ramming his head into the wall. It was like he was possessed. It scared the cheese out of me. Since then, nothing like that has happened. But what an unexplainable event. This happened about 9 years ago on July 5th. We had some extra fireworks, so we decided to grab a few beers and launch them off. I was living on the north shore of Long Island at the time, and at the end of my road was a 100-foot cliff with stairs to the beach. Along the sides of the cliff, there was a trail. On the left side, you have a 100-foot drop to the beach. On the right, a large state park. There's nothing for a good 4 miles into the park. We finish up with the fireworks at around 3 a.m. and decide to head back home. Forgot to mention, it's just me and my 2 good friends. We were just bullshitting and cracking jokes as we walk, when we hear some leaves rustling on our left. We weren't freaked out at first. It's a big state park with a ton of deer. But about 5 minutes later, we hear some more rustling. But it's for a longer period of time, and sounds distinctly like someone walking. We stop to listen, but as soon as we stop, the rustling stops. We were too stupid to bring a flashlight, and this was before flashlights on cell phones, so all we had was the light from the screen. We make it about 50 more feet, and all of a sudden, we hear the rustling again. This time, it's right on top of us, and a man comes out of the woods. It was extremely dark, but we could see that this man was wearing a pinstripe suit, matching top hat, and thin-rimmed circular glasses. He just looked at us and said, "Hello, good evening, gentlemen." We hauled ass and never looked back. Ran for about 3 minutes before we reached the end of the trail. To this day, I have no idea why that man would be deep in the woods, alone, in a full fucking suit, at 3 a.m. Still gives me chills typing this story out. My parents bought a house from a man quite a few years ago. He had some major issues. He tried to commit suicide in the basement, etc. After my parents bought the house, his ex-wife ran into my mom one day and asked if we had met Mabel yet. She claimed Mabel was the ghost that lived in the house, and said she would sometimes wake up at night to the feeling of someone stroking her hair or cheek. Apparently, Mabel had burned to death, though we never actually looked into this. We didn't really think much of it for a while, but come the winter months, weird things would start happening in the house. One morning, my mom woke up to the stove being on. Another morning, she left to do some groceries and came home to a half cup of coffee sitting on the counter. She hadn't made coffee because she'd gone to a friend's house for coffee that morning. And our dog, who was mostly an inside dog, was outside, in negative 40-degree weather. My sister and I were at school, and my dad was at work. All the doors were locked when she came home, so it couldn't have been someone who snuck into the house. On another occasion, I was in the garage grabbing firewood, and had to walk across the double garage to get to the woodpile. At the time, we had a cow hanging in there before we were off to have it cut and wrapped. As I'm grabbing an armful of wood, the garage light switched off. The door was really heavy and squeaky, so I would have known if someone had opened the door to shut off the light. The strangest thing that happened, though, again, happened in the winter months. My mom and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner. She was on the phone with a friend when we started smelling smoke. She got off the phone and we started searching the house to see where it was coming from. Turns out, some papers in the bottom of a box in my bedroom closet were burning. We were the only ones home that day. While we lived there, we would hear footsteps going up and down the 4 flights of stairs, walking up and down the hallway, and sometimes our dog would suddenly wake from her sleep and growl in specific areas. Looking back on it, it really was quite an interesting house. It was known in that town for being creepy, and apparently, the title was very fitting. So there's this place out in the middle of the woods, I live in the south, where anyone who fools around with 4-wheelers, dirt bikes, and so on goes to go muddin'. That's exactly what it sounds like. You ride around in the mud until you're absolutely covered in it. Well, one time, I was hanging out with my brother and some of his buddies, and I guess they were from out of town or something, because he was trying to describe this place in order to tempt them to go there with him, ride around, drink, and act dumb together. But after talking about how crazy the hills are, how there are mud pits to peel out in and fling mud everywhere, he then tells them, but you want to be careful, because you don't want to get caught there after dark. When it starts getting dark out, you leave ASAMFP as soon as motherfucking possible. Well, this piqued their curiosity as to why, so they asked. This local boy we were with said that he and 2 or 3 other boys had driven down there in their trucks, went mudding for the day, and then were stupid enough to stay out after dark. He said that a bunch of crazy people with sticks and rocks came out of the woods and were beating on their trucks, throwing rocks at their windows, climbing on the hood, trying to open the doors and climb through the windows and sunroof. They were shouting and threatening them until they drove the fuck out of there. But that's not even the scary/crazy part, although I would have shat myself if that happened to me personally. My brother had this friend that I very vividly remember him hanging out with a lot. Until he told this story, I never really questioned why I never saw him hanging out again, and admittedly, I sort of forgot he existed. But my brother told us that there had always been stories of hills have eyes, inbred motherfuckers. Pretty much his exact words. My brother's a little bit of a redneck, living not too far from this muddin' spot. So after the guy told us about that incident with the people in the woods, my brother went on to say that after a lot of partying and drinking, and at dusk, one of his buddies decided to go down there on his dirt bike. Well, my brother kept insisting he not do it, because of what everyone has apparently heard about the people who allegedly live around there, and how people, like the guy we were with, were first-hand witnesses to them not being very friendly. Drunk and looking to act stupid, his buddy didn't listen. After he had gone missing for a couple days, they went down to the spot to see if he was still there. They found his dirt bike busted to pieces and abandoned, but no one has seen or heard from the guy since. I really couldn't fucking believe it when my brother said all this, as I remembered the boy hanging out with my brother all the time, even back when I was much, much younger. But he was being dead serious, and even my mom told me it's true that he went missing and hasn't been found. But she doesn't know what to think of the Hills Have Eyes people, or the 4-wheeler spot. So I guess the theory is that the people who live secluded out in the deep woods, who may or may not be a family of incest freaks, although take that with a grain of salt, killed him for being so close to their property out in the middle of nowhere. And if the other story is true, about how the people from the woods came out and were trying to get into their trucks and pull them out to, well, I guess beat them with rocks and sticks, and if that boy who really went missing went down there the night he disappeared, I wouldn't be surprised one bit if much, much worse is what really happened.